We're live.
Hello, hello. Hi, everybody. If you're watching, welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. My name is Marie, and I'm an executive functioning coach with Effective Artistry, which is a neurodiversity affirming therapy practice based in Northbrook in Illinois. I'm joined as ever by Brandon Tessers, Clinical Director of Effective Artistry, and Caitlin Miller, therapist at the practice. Hello. Good to
Hello.
see you both.
Nice
How are
to
you
see
both doing?
Good to see you. Doing all right. I'm working from home today, which is why Caitlin and I are in different setting than usual. Caitlin is in the office, but usually we both are in my office when we meet. So she's in her own office because there's been illness in my family, but I'm doing all right.
Yeah.
How are you?
I'm doing okay. I didn't get much sleep last night, and I just had like a good experience earlier today, but it was, I don't know, just coming down from it, and yeah, kind of distracted.
How about you, Marie?
I'm doing okay. Yeah. Not a lot been happening here. My boyfriend's just been and gone for a flying visit, so we had a really nice weekend where we ate a lot of food and just relaxed and hung out, and it was really nice. So
Nice.
I'm missing him today, but otherwise fine.
I'm not familiar with that phrase. Did you say flying visit or fly-in visit?
A flying visit, yeah. It's a short visit where you fly in and fly out. Yeah.
Good to know.
I was like,
Cool.
maybe you're like autistic fae in Scotland, and it's like you're flying while you're visiting because you're able to fly. That's what I thought. Yeah.
Caitlin has there's a I think we've talked about this on the stream before, but there's a old, I don't know, myth, I guess you'd call it, of the changeling, the human baby that was taken and replaced with a fae baby instead. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of theorizing that changeling was like what people would call people that were autistic, in the UK back in the day. So Caitlin has a very strong connection between the fae and autistic. Those two things just connect for that. I just wanted to give some, when you said autistic fae, I was like, let's explain that connection.
No, I'm honored for you to be my translator, Brandon. You're a great translator. Probably like the best there is. So
yeah. Just reminded me of something I totally forgot to do. Well, thanks.
We have a saying in Ireland, if somebody is lost in thought or kind of zoning out, and it usually refers to children, that they're away with the fairies. So that the fae have been and taken them away and left the changeling behind, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So there you go.
Yeah.
My favorite phrase for that is staring into the middle distance. I have no idea what it means or the origin, but I just love it.
It sounds like Taoism or like Buddhism, Zen Buddhism. The middle path, middle distance, meditative stance, whatever. Yeah.
Maybe. Anyway. Did you finish the like bringing everybody on board stuff, Marie? I don't.
No, I just wanted to say, if you're watching, it's your first time here. The show is called This Is Not Therapy. So just as the title goes, it's not therapy, but it's a chance for you to ask questions of Brandon and Caitlin. So you can pop a message in the chat. Just be aware that if you do leave a message in the chat, it will come up under your username, whether you're joining us on Facebook or YouTube or Twitch. So just be mindful of that. It will be a public post. But Brandon and Caitlin will do their best to answer any questions you have in relation to neurodiversity, mental health, or anything else connected to therapy. But it's not a therapy session. It's open office hours. So you've got a question, feel free to ask, and we'll do our best to answer. I think that was everything. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, last week we had a fun conversation. People in the chat were asking questions about like spirituality and stuff. So we got a very fun conversation talking about, I don't know, very fun but philosophical concepts of God and all kinds of things. The afterlife, I think we discussed at one point. Anyway,
my mother enjoyed it, which means A+.
Well, there we go.
Well done.
I wish I knew your mother's name off the top of my head, because then I would have said making her Okay.
Karin, but it's like it's German, so it's like Karin or whatever. But I never, so I just do the American thing. But yeah, but it's the like
Does
German.
anybody use the German pronunciation of her name?
Yeah, my uncle and my grandmother, and my grandmother's first language is German, so it's so much more beautiful that way.
Honestly, names have always been, I've been intrigued by this particular like pronunciation of names, because a name I would think anyway, it's up to the individual whose name it is to determine what's the like correct pronunciation. If you pronounce it the way that they want it pronounced, then it's correct, you know? But there are those questions that come up of like, well, really it would be pronounced, you know, in the original language, it'd be pronounced whatever. I don't know. I just always find that interesting. I mean, people having the final say over their name and how it's to be used and whatever, I think is important. Anyway,
Well,
not
I
a
think
point.
one of the things with the pronunciation of her name is I don't think many people can do a proper German R, so it's kind of like, okay, we'll just do whatever. I don't know.
Well, what does she say? How does she pronounce it?
Let's change the subject.
Okay.
That's a
All
great
right.
question. No, I do want to ask her these things. I don't think I've ever talked to her about it particularly, specifically.
I mean, my mom's name is Nia and my dad's name is Fritz with an S. So I have a history of uncommon names, I guess. My mom's full name is Virginia, but she goes by Nia as like that's her name. No one calls her Virginia. Nia is not like her nickname. It's her name on everything. And she spells it N-E-A instead of N-I-A, which is what it is at the end of Virginia's N-I-A. And I don't know actually the full story on why she spells it that way or not. And then my dad is Fritz, but Dutch, not German. And so it's an S at the end instead of a Z, and that confuses everybody. Lots of fun name stuff. Tessers, I love as my surname because it is ethnically ambiguous. Nobody can, and because I am ethnically ambiguous, people are like looking for clues, and they're like, that name does not tell me who, you know. It's Dutch, if anybody cares. Tessers is Dutch. Anyway, names, whatever. What are we going to talk about today? What's on people's minds?
In the chat, or like us humans?
Yeah, us, anybody.
I don't see anything in the chat yet, so.
I'm going to try to take away my ability to see myself. Is that possible on Twitch?
I don't know.
I don't see it. Never mind. Let's leave it. Distracting.
I always have the self view on. I look at myself way more than I look at the person that I'm talking to when it comes to like Zoom or whatever, like video call interactions.
Yeah.
Which I have heard, but don't have good data on this, but I've heard that's a fairly common thing for certain kinds of neurodivergent people, that it's almost like a stim in a sense to be able to look at yourself instead of the other person during a conversation.
Yeah.
We don't get to see ourselves, right? So
I'm so
we're sat in front of a mirror all day.
Honestly, I mean, I was an actor in my younger days, and I still obviously have nowhere near as much time seeing myself and what my face looks like and everything as over the past, I guess, almost 4 years now of being a therapist since the beginning of the pandemic. And I'll switch to remote. I mean, I see myself in real time on camera for hours a day. I mean, there have been times where it was 8 hours a day for 5 days a week, you know, which has been, I've actually quite enjoyed it. I feel like I have such a better understanding of my face and how to communicate with it, like, you know, what it looks like when it feels like certain things. I've liked it. But yes, obviously, well aware, as Caitlin was saying, that it drives some people up the wall to see themselves on camera.
Bonkers. Yeah, it's funny when I was doing, I'm going to try putting this. When I was doing opera, can you still see me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there we go. I fixed it. When I was doing opera, I wouldn't actually practice the acting in a mirror because I would always act so much worse. I would practice the acting through physically moving my body without looking at myself while I was doing it, and then that would always be the best acting. I would like feel it internally, and then it would like manifest as though I was the person feeling those things. But I did not watch myself.
It's not an uncommon thing for performers to like, including very famous ones that refuse to watch their own performances. Is
No, I would
practicing
watch
acting?
performances ex post facto, but like preparing for them and stuff, it just always messed with my head to like see the facial expressions, to see the movements, just because then it would be like, well, it could be a little bit more this way or this way, like so much analysis.
Is practicing the acting in the mirror, is that a common practice in opera?
I don't know. It can take different forms, but what I was thinking of is like practicing an aria that you would use for an audition. You essentially have to like stand by a piano. And so there are various types of physical movements that were typically allowed within opera that would show different emotions and also be appropriate to the aria and the opera and the language. And so it was almost this dance of like in like the belly of the piano, like how much do you move, how much do you not move? And then a lot of the old school teachers would be like, don't move, it's all about the voice, it's all about the face, it's all about the posture. And then other people were like, moving makes so much sense, that's a much more natural thing. And so yeah, so they often encouraged people to practice in front of a mirror if you were practicing an aria. And then also sometimes with operatic staging, they would like take a video and say, hey, when you're doing this aria and you do this specific thing, it usually blah, 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 like looks weird, essentially.
Interesting.
But singing and acting opera is very interesting because it is not the pace of a sentence. So you can like say this profoundly dramatic thing over like 2 minutes and it's technically a sentence, and so it's just like it's so archetypal. Hi, Brandon.
It is. There's a lot of commedia dell'arte kind of in that operatic world. I had never heard, in the acting world, I've never heard anyone like practice acting in a mirror. That's the kind of thing that generally like people would be advised to stay away from. Mm-hmm. So it was interesting when you said that.
Yeah, I've had people do a lot of like self tapes and then watch it and then, but like not watch themselves in the moment.
Especially these last few years, every audition is you tape and send it in. So anyway, I mean, I'm happy talking about what we're talking about, but I also feel like I might have gotten us onto like a particular sidetrack. What do we want to discuss today?
Oh no, I got nothing on my mind. Well, that's probably not true, but there's nothing jumping out right now.
Fair enough.
On my very long docket of things that I would like to ask you about, Brandon, one of them that's coming up recently is the creative process and hearing your thoughts of it.
Yeah, how is it coming up? Tell me about this. Are you like engaging in this? Trying to engage in the creative? Okay, cool. Mm-hmm. Tell me a bit about. I mean, you don't have to give me details. The creative process is a very broad category, so maybe some.
Let's say getting into a place in which I am consciously having no metacognition, being in the moment and creating a piece of original art that is authentic to myself. And I have noticed the less I think, the better, whatever. Okay, the better the art is in the sense of it's more unique and it feels like it is more me. It's not like better as in like, oh, if you think when you're creating art, that's a bad thing. Like, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Just for me recently, the less I think, the better it feels, like the end product, as well as the more I enjoy it in the moment. And I was curious about how many observations surrounding that you might have and what language you might associate with it, because I usually use phrases like flow state or play, but I feel like it might be useful to hear the way you conceptualize this, Brandon Tessers.
Okay, cool. Well, one thing I think is worth putting out there is that metacognition, typically when people use that phrase, they're not talking about like a in the moment experience of thinking about your thinking in that moment. Typically they're referring to like doing an analysis or looking back over or evaluating your patterns of cognition, that kind of thing. And then yes, I would say, like we talked about a couple weeks ago, if you're conscious, you're thinking, right? That there's no such thing as not thinking.
Mm-hmm.
You just might not be as aware of it. Your attention is focused on other places besides your own cognitive environment. So
Can I repeat that? So my goal would be that in the moment, my cognitive awareness would not include the fact that I am thinking.
Yeah, I mean, in essence, you're paying attention to what you're doing and not to what you're thinking about what you're doing or about what you're about to do or about anything else.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, it is. When you say it's more me, right? Like the art is more me. I think another way of talking about that is to say that you're not editing it as much, right? That whatever's happening is happening. You're responding to whatever you're observing in the environment. You put a line down and then you put another line down based on that.
Mm-hmm.
Where the more that someone is thinking about, is this good? You know, will people like it? The more you're thinking about that in the moment, the less of your attention is going to the thing that you are actually doing.
Mm-hmm.
Which doesn't mean, I mean, that's useful and even, you know, preferable depending on what stage in the process you're in and like what you're trying to do. But flow state or peak experience or being in the zone, empty mind, no thought, like a lot of different phrases to all refer to that state where you are not aware of your own thinking. And generally, it's always talked about as a very good thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that some of that is because you're doing the best that you can do in that moment, right? Best is a nebulous term here, but for whatever it is that you are trying to accomplish, all of your attentional resources are dedicated to that thing. The other thing about being in the zone or whatever is that it's typically referring to you're doing something right then and there in that moment, right? You're paying attention to the environment rather than to your own internal environment, exterior physical environment, and you're doing something moment to moment in that environment. You know, it's often talked about with physical activities, sports and things like that, but art too, which is a physical, the execution part of art is a physical
What would you
activity.
think about as a prerequisite to designing improving executive functioning around the creative process would be some version of how can we design an environment in which you are most likely to focus on what you are doing and not on cognition?
Well, I mean, are you asking about what we can do in the environment to make that the most likely?
Well, I feel like essentially yes, but I feel like with a lot of my artistic clients, who also identify as neurodivergent, that usually that's kind of the first place we go to is like how to get you in this state, sort of how to get you out of cognition while you're creating things.
Well, this is going to sound maybe paradoxical.
Yeah.
Well, okay, let me finish that statement, but then I decided that there would be a better place to start, but I'll finish that statement. This is going to sound maybe paradoxical, but one of the things that I think is most conducive to that is to accept that you don't need it. You don't have to get out of cognition. That if you're thinking, then you're thinking, and that's fine. It's kind of like the same as trying to get yourself to fall asleep. The more important that you think it is that you not be thinking, the more difficult it is for you to stop thinking.
Yeah, I was actually thinking that earlier, to not like have sort of a vibe off this stream to be like, if you're thinking during your creative process, you're doing it wrong, or like you shouldn't be creating when you are aware of thinking.
Well, so let's back up a little bit and talk about creativity and the creative process and whatever, because really it sounds like what you're talking about is an artistic process specifically, right? I'm trying to clarify. Is that you're talking about creative
What do you mean
process in
by
terms of
artistic?
making art?
What do you mean by artistic versus creative?
Okay, so creative is about making new connections, right? You can do anything creatively. You can file your taxes creatively.
Mm-hmm.
Creativity means I'm taking A and connecting it to D, where those two things had not previously been connected for me. This is also important, I think, especially for artists. It is not about that you're the first person ever to make the connection. Other people have made those connections in the past.
Mm-hmm.
But when we're talking about creativity, from like a cognitive science standpoint, we're talking about connecting things in new ways.
Mm-hmm.
Art is about doing things in a particular format, utilizing a particular medium.
So I would like to have this be about the artistic process in the most creative form of it.
Okay. I mean, art is creative. Yeah, he's
Oh.
going down for a nap and apparently unhappy about it.
Oh. Why do I have to sleep, Brandon?
Yeah, he likes to stay up. Anyway. Sorry. So art, the artistic process it involves creativity, for sure. This is kind of one of those like all ducks are birds, but not all birds are ducks things.
Yeah, that's what it feels
There are many, many things that involve creativity that are not art, but art involves creativity.
Mm-hmm.
And to define specifically what art is, we've talked about when is a pile, right? Like it's one of those words that people are going to use it differently. To me, the way I have found it, as I often do, I have my own definitions of words, even though I know they're not correct. It's just the way it helps me to think about things. I think of art as something that is created with the express purpose of being shared with an audience. That the difference between doodling and visual art is, am I doing this with the idea that other people will be impacted by it or interact with it or observe it at some point?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't always happen, right? Like I might be creating something with that intention and never end up finishing it or putting it out to people or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But that intent is part of what makes it art as opposed to just journaling or whatever other thing it might be.
Okay.
Which isn't to say it's better. But yes, the artistic process is always going to be creative.
But I am talking about the artistic process then, specifically composing music with piano and voice, as well as creating ceramic objects.
Yeah, I like this. Actually, at one point I was like pretty deep into designing like a workshop series, like an artistic process series that I was trying to like, have one meant for visual artists, one for writers, one, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And
Did
so
you
I spent
see
a lot
my
of time.
messages about, did you read the thing about Molly, EAC or whatever?
Yes.
Okay.
I think I read most of it. Caitlin's referring to, I've been out over the last week. I've been working from home and some days not working very much. Last week, my son came home from school sick. We took him to the doctor the next day and they said he had strep. And then the following day, the other test results came back and he also had COVID and influenza A.
Poor baby.
All three at the same time. So for the past week, we've had various things going through our family. And Caitlin, when she said messaging, we used like GChat, Google Chat to message within.
Yeah, and I had just messaged you with something about, doing like more art groups or stuff like that. So that's why I was like, oh, this is a fun topic to come up today.
Yeah. Well, there's lots of specifics. I started down some different. I'd have to like access, go look up the things that I was working on back then. It was a few years ago, but I'd spent a lot of time thinking about this and broken down the artistic process into like 5 different categories and like different steps and whatever.
Mm-hmm. I feel like our theme of 2024 is going to be like bring back 2020, Brandon. Like I'm resurrecting him.
Cool. Here's the thing about the artistic process is that people tend to focus on what I would call like the production phase, which is the actual like doing the physical things necessary to make the art exist in the physical reality, right? Whether
Yeah.
that's putting paint on a canvas or hitting notes on a piano or whatever. But obviously that's not the first step in the artistic process. And there's different ways of talking about this. You know, the one that's really popular among artists, there's a book called The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. That's, I don't know, people like do their own impromptu kind of workshops and go along stuff together, but I think there's official ones too.
Yeah,
that talks about this. But there's a bunch of different ways of talking about it. In other words, you have to, it's a cycle. You don't create out of nowhere, right? Like you have to have experiences and gather and collect data and ideas. Then you have to create, meaning connect those things in ways that are new to you. And then you have to produce that, execute that. And then I would say that the next step is then to share, to put it in front of the audience. And then it cycles, right? Putting it in front of the audience is when you're starting to get more information, more data, and then you go and you create and make new connections, and then you produce, and then you share, and so on and so forth. So, as I like to do a lot of the time, I'll talk about it depends on what you're trying to do. Particularly with art, there's two different ways that I would generally suggest to people to start this process. One is if you know what you're aiming at, not necessarily like what piece, you know, what is it that you're trying to create or produce, but what purpose you're aiming at. You know, if you're trying to paint something that you can sell, if you're trying to work on an audition piece that you want to be able to go do, you know, if you're just making something for fun for your friends and you to enjoy, whatever. But that's not always how it works. You don't always have an idea of what exactly it is you're aiming at. So we'll put a pin in that and come back to it. And then the other is to just start, just do stuff. That like, and I think this might be, if I had to guess, I think this might be more what you're talking about, Caitlin, that like, if you want to write a song, you just sit down and you put your hands on the piano and you just start hitting keys and you just mess around until something ends up happening.
How would you say composing a song on the piano as an example, how that would be different from like the preparation stage you were talking about earlier? Like, would that be a time when someone would be like, I'm thinking about doing it in a minor key with this chord progression, and I was thinking about it having this theme or something, versus like just doing it in the moment and seeing what happens?
Well, so that first thing you said about like, I think I'm doing it in a minor key, that would be part of the process that started with, I know what I'm aiming at.
Yeah.
And then messing around on the piano is part of the process where it's like, I'm not aiming at a particular thing. I just want to start creating something. And effectively it's different points in the cycle, right? We talk about this outside of art. We talk about this a lot, that there are two different ways to gain information. One is through direct personal observation, which, you know, that plays into all versions of getting experience, trying something and seeing what happens, looking around the corner to see what's there, right? Like your own direct observation and experience. The other is to get information via communication with other people, that other people can share information with you through whatever communicative methods. And so this is like that, the like sitting down and just messing around is you're getting information about what you want to do through your own direct experience. You're just hitting keys, and we'll stick with playing the piano, you know, writing a piece on the piano for the examples. That you just hit random keys, and every sound that hits your ear, you have a response to, and some you're gonna say, "Ooh, I like that," and then you just kind of start. Sometimes it's the feeling in your fingers, you know, something about a particular interval or chord just feels nice. Or holding and sustaining it for a while. So that's that way of getting information by just direct personal observation and experience. If you're doing what I call ideating, which is the like cognitive, creative portion, the coming up with the idea of the art. If you're doing that, then that's something, if you're doing that before sitting down at the piano, then that would be something that to me started in the other way. You know what you're aiming at, right? Like if I were going to sit down and start before sitting down to write on the piano to say I want it in a minor key, then I'd have to have some idea of what I'm aiming at. Maybe I'm writing a piece for a musical and I know that this particular piece is at a sad point in the arc of the story and it needs to have.
I keep thinking that with more ideation, do you think that makes it sometimes harder to actually create? Because I've had clients be like,
yes and no.
I had this. Okay, tell me more. What's yes and no?
I think the longer you're ideating, the harder it is to transition from ideation into what I call execution, which is the part where you have to actually like put the stuff out there.
That totally applies to someone I know right
now. Which is also, again, not specific to art or creativity. Just the more you think about something, the more difficult it becomes to actually go put that into practice. Mm-hmm. As it should, right? Theoretically, the reason that we would think about something a lot is because it's very important to get it done in a particular way when you do it. That messing around and experimenting and learning by trial and error is not a great way to approach that. So that's why I'm thinking about it so much. So a lot of where people, I think, get stuck, again, not just with art, but in a lot of ways, is when they're treating things where trial and error is the most efficient way because the cost of a failed experiment is so minor as to be negligible. Mm-hmm. They're treating that as though it's something where it's like, if you get it wrong the first time, you're going to die. So you better think about it for a long time. And so, of course, the more we think about something, the more that we drive into ourselves like, okay, until I have the right idea, I can't go. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, if we didn't think that, we would have gone already.
I think that I'm really hesitant to say this, but this is just authentically what's coming to my mind. I think that process has wasted 7 years of my life.
Yeah, I get that. I get that personally. And
I'm really careful. I challenge people when they say things like wasted time, but it was just like the thing that came to mind.
Yeah, so there's this funny thing in economics where like what something is worth is defined as what somebody is willing to pay for it, right? So if I have a piece of garbage that I auction off and somebody pays $10,000 for it, then by definition, that piece of garbage is worth $10,000. Mm-hmm. And that kind of futzes with some things and makes some interesting things. But in this case, especially through the lens of cost and value, accomplishment equation stuff, if you think about something for 5 weeks, then it is that valuable to you. Mm-hmm. You can't think about something for 5 weeks that is not, in your estimation, worth thinking about for 5 weeks. And something that's worth thinking about for 5 weeks is not only incredibly important, but that there's a massive delta between the success and the failure condition, a huge gap.
And multiply that by 5 years.
Well, sure. I mean, the longer you think about something, the more important it feels, and the larger the difference between the success and the failure. And I'm trying to clarify, because there are things that are very important, but it's like, hey, this is super important, and if I nail it, I get 100, and if I really biff it, it's a 99. So like, even though the activity is important, the gap between it, in that case, it's still not worth thinking about very much because I can just try it. A failed experiment doesn't really cost me that much. Mm-hmm. And with art in particular, this does seem to be something that I'm hearing a lot about. I don't know. I can't say why, but to me, it feels like something that's becoming more prevalent as time goes on, is this idea that I can't put my stuff out there until I'm ready to like be successful. You know what I mean? Mm. They're like, I can't put a song out there until it's done, which logically speaking is absurd. That's not how it works at all. And this is more true as time goes on because of technology. The cost of putting something out there goes down further and further, and therefore logically it would be put your stuff out earlier and more frequently.
Well, for me, like I was thinking about that too, if we stick with music, you know, if you like write a song and whatever happens to it happens, but then a couple years later you're like, oh, I just thought of this amazing additional blah blah blah, or I want to like change it. I think there is a beauty in the internet right now to be like, oh, I just updated this song and this was it is what it is, instead of like a book that's published once and it's never published again, and if you say stuff in it that's ridiculous, you just have to like die on that hill.
See, the funny thing is though that that's not even how book publishing works, and right, like how many editions the copy I have of Man's Search for Meaning is like the 4th edition, and is at the beginning
I thought editions though were correlated with how successful it is. So like if you write a book that's not really successful, then the publisher isn't incentivized to do an edition, right? Because it costs
sure
money.
Although if you write a book that isn't very successful and then later on want to continue to refine some of those ideas and the stuff that you were working on in that book, then you just put it out as a new and different book. And because the first one wasn't, nobody knows about it, so nobody's going to say this is just your revising of your earlier work. You know,
that is a good point. Thank you, Brandon.
That's bringing the cost way down. I like that.
Yeah. Art is about iteration, as all communication is. One of my favorite ways to talk about art, again, is it's done with the express purpose of being shared with an audience, right? Meaning that art is a particular version of communication, that under the like umbrella of communication, art is communication that I am doing. I, as the artist, am initiating, sending out this communication, but to unknown recipients at a future different location where I will not be. So it's still communication, but it's communication I'm sending to people I don't know who they are. As opposed to like, you know, in school when you're taught to write, you're taught know your audience, right? Like pick who you're writing to, write to your professor, whatever. And that's advice that's shared in art a lot. In the sense of like what we were talking about before. If you're going to ideate first, if you're going to think about, okay, I want to create something specifically for all those kids out there that are such and such, right? Like it helps you kind of, because I said yes and no on the ideating makes it easier or harder. The other part, I was talking about how it makes it harder to shift into actually doing stuff. But the part where it makes it better, easier, is there's a quote from a guy named Mark Rosewater, who's been the head of design for Magic the Gathering, the card game, for 20 or 30 years. Before that, he was a television writer. He says, restrictions breed creativity, which is true. It's kind of a different version of saying necessity is the mother of invention, right? That if you say, if I say to you, Caitlin, go and write a song, well, that's okay. That's a lot. That's hard. It's difficult to know where to start. There's so much to do. But if I say to you, Caitlin, go and write me a song, but only using notes from these 2 octaves on the piano, then all of a sudden it becomes easier to start taking action because you have some parameters. So that's the yes and the no. It makes it harder to actually start doing a thing, but it makes it easier to come up with ideas of what to do.
So then do we just find a balance?
Well, I mean, yes, in effect, we do. But it also, if we're trying to optimize it, again, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. These different things are best addressed in different ways. If you're trying to sell something...
Go ahead, sorry. If you're trying to sell something?
If you're trying to sell something to an identified audience, like you know who it is you're trying to sell to, then yeah, you should do, I think optimally, you would do a lot of gathering information via communication rather than experience first. But different art forms and their industries are handled differently. You know, how to make it as an actor is very different than how to make it as a musician.
What do you mean by make it?
You know, get to a point where you're making money consistently off of your art enough to support yourself. Some art forms are more communal in nature. Some are more solitary. Like this is, I think, a big part of what performance art, like it draws certain types of people more so than the other because it's communal. Like theater is, you are working with a bunch of other people. Even if it's a 1-person show, there's still a bunch of other people you're working with in the creation and backstage. And where you can be a musician by yourself, or especially the most solitary, being a writer. You can be a writer off by yourself. That's not optimal, but you can do it.
Not optimal.
Anyway, I'm jumping all over the place. I forgot where I even cut myself off last. Because I wanted to make sure to finish that point of why it can be beneficial as well as detrimental to think a lot before you do stuff. Where was I? What were we talking about? I lost it.
I guess
I saw it. Go ahead.
a place my brain goes to is like, so what are the steps of the creative process or the artistic process? And then, I don't know.
Well, so it's a version of something that you and I were talking about recently, Caitlin, in my way of talking about the acquisition, arrangement, application thing. You get information, you come up with an idea, you execute the idea, and then in executing that idea, you get more information. The art, I mean, all things for sure, but art especially should be looked at as an iterative process. That your first, another fun quote from a show called Adventure Time, a little cartoon that I've never watched, but memes and all that. Sucking at something is the first step on the road to being kind of good at something.
I like that.
Can we talk for a moment about judging the either skill level you have or the quality of the artistic output at the end of?
Yes, please, let's.
How do you do that? I have been
You
wrong
don't.
so many times.
Yeah. And the lesson that you've taken from that is that you could be better at it and therefore be right more? No.
Yeah. So is this the audience like ABC thing or whatever that you talk about?
Yeah. Alpha, beta, and then wide release. Another one of my little frameworks.
Yeah.
What you decide is when it's time to share it with a particular person, right? Like when it's time to share it with your spouse, when it's time to just put it out there and share it with the public at large, when it's time to send it to your editor. What you decide is just that. The only evaluation you get to make is, am I ready to share it? You do not get to decide whether it's good or not. And I know that there are other ways of like approaching this, and other people would say different things. I want to be clear about that.
Yeah, this is just,
I'm very big on what's called the death of the author. There's this big essay written by a critic called Roland Barthes. The main idea being that once the art is created, the author, the person who created the art, does not matter. That art is what happens between the art and the audience. And while the audience members' knowledge of the artist and or the artist's intentions can influence that experience, if it does, it does. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Meaning that that's not the integral part of what it is. Or an even better, I love the show Bluey, the cartoon Bluey. Genuinely, it is a children's cartoon, but I'm telling you, and I'm certainly not alone in this. Genuinely, I think one of the top 5 television shows ever made. It is incredible.
I've heard so many good things from people I know who are parents.
Highly recommend. Yeah, I mean, kids love it, and that's part of its brilliance. And certainly a lot of it is very evocative and relevant to people who are parents, but it's not just either of those things. Anyway, there's an episode that came out recently of it where blah, 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 skip to the end. Come on, Brad. Where one of the characters eventually says, look, once you create something beautiful and put it out into the world, it's no longer yours, really.
Wow.
Which I think is an important way to think of this as artists. In other words, you can evaluate whether you think it's good or whether you think it's bad. So fucking, nope. That might be the first time I ever said the F word on the stream.
You didn't. You were so close, but you didn't.
I blame
Maybe I can try to bleep.
I blame the illness.
It's the
Caitlin, you just said you've been wrong, right? So you evaluated it.
Almost
you thought it was
always
bad.
wrong, too. Almost always.
The very fact that it is possible for you to be wrong, for a person to be wrong, what does that state? Is that your opinion of the piece is not the thing that determines whether it is good or bad. So it doesn't really matter.
But couldn't you argue that other people's opinions of the piece also doesn't determine it because there isn't a good or a bad?
Yes, you could. And I think that is an accurate way to say it, is that what makes a piece of art good and bad, like we've talked about a lot, these are opinion words. These are words that describe the way that a person is perceiving a thing.
Mm-hmm.
So one person will say this is great art, and one person will say this is crap art.
Mm-hmm.
Which again reinforces that this is not even the right thing to be trying to evaluate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What you were
The
trying
thing that scares me about our culture, at least at this point, is how much like I'm worried about you. Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm all right. I'm just very tail end dregs of things.
Yeah. I worry about like how much people get attached to you are the person who did this thing. So even like with effective artistry, like the more we put out content and things like that, like maybe there's something very silly that was like behind the times that was said 3 years ago, and it's a 30-second clip from a stream, and then it becomes like, I don't know, just that stuff. But I guess that's something that no one can control.
There's a comment.
Yeah, I was just going to say, yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Marie.
I was just going to say hi, Bast Insider, and that there's a comment to this effect that
I
scared things out because we're all scarred by the immortality of social media.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I think I've talked about this on the stream before, and if not, I know Caitlin, you and I have talked about this. If you judge people in any particular kind of a way, then you're judging yourself in that way too.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That if you think that a comment somebody made 4 years ago is like a very important piece of evaluating that person, then that means you think that about yourself too. And I'm not saying that it isn't. I would say it depends a lot on the context and the specifics. There's nuance, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also, you don't learn.
Mm-hmm.
You don't do something, you don't learn.
Mm-hmm.
So, to me, the thing that is difficult about being an artist is not like the skill required. There are tons and tons of examples of people who've become very successful artists, not just financially and culturally, but in terms of creating art that was very impactful and relevant for many people. There are tons of examples of people who have been very successful that are not very skilled at all. Right?
Mm-hmm.
The entire punk rock movement, one of the kind of founding principles of punk rock was you don't have to know how to play your instrument very well at all. You can just channel your anger through that.
Mm-hmm.
It was almost a requirement to be punk in the beginning, was that you don't know how to do anything but slam a few power chords, and that your singer doesn't hit the right notes and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Skill is great, but there's also what would often be called like motel art, where the art is very skilled but doesn't have an impactful interaction, or people don't have very impactful interactions with it. In other words, you don't know what people are going to like or aren't. And I think there's this survivorship bias, this cognitive bias, survivorship bias of we're evaluating. It makes inherent sense that if I'm trying to create things that I think other people will enjoy, that I would look at things that already exist that I know many other people enjoy to get a sense of what it is that people seem to enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not optional, right? Like, you're exposed to things as you move throughout your life.
Mm-hmm.
Your language is founded by blah, blah, blah. So that's great. But then we have this survivorship bias thing where we're only looking at the end result of the people who got to that point.
Mm-hmm.
We're not looking at the people who didn't get there, and we're not looking at the earlier failed efforts of the people who got there. We're only looking at the later successful efforts.
Mm-hmm.
It's iterative.
Mm-hmm.
Every single artist will tell you that they think their more recent stuff is way better than their early stuff. And like we've talked about, there's different ways to phrase the same thing. But the statement, my recent stuff is much better than my early stuff, is the same as the statement, my early stuff is not nearly as good as my recent stuff, right? Like no artist creates something.
I keep getting stuck in this, which to me doesn't make any sense, because this to me sounds like a person like managing, like, I don't know, a famous like Adele or something. But I'm thinking, oh, well, if Adele comes out with an album that isn't widely received well, then although her process is technically iterative, if she does a series of stuff that people don't care about, then eventually she just fades away and dies and crumbles.
Except she doesn't, right?
Yeah.
Like you can become less famous without dying.
Yeah, that is a very good point. Because I'll have clients, and I think that way sometimes too, where like if you do something really good, then the next thing, oh, Elizabeth Gilbert, there was like an interview after her Eat, Pray, Love book where she was like, I was literally frozen for I think a year in writer's block because she was terrified of publishing the book after Eat, Pray, Love because she was nearly completely sure it would not be as successful. And I think it wasn't, but I think the one after that was as successful or something. And so
yeah, what was it called? So it wasn't, right? Because we all know Eat, Pray, Love.
Oh, that's such a good point. Yeah.
But also this woman was being interviewed after at least 2 more successive attempts, which weren't as successful as that earlier one.
Mm-hmm.
It's honestly the most common
part of her
thing.
point, just to be clear, was that like it's not a bad thing and it's okay. Like she wasn't trying to say like, so therefore never write another book or something.
Right. And that's reinforcing the point I'm trying to make here about evaluating good or bad is not only not doable, it's actively harmful to the artistic process.
Yeah.
Because the more, including someone who has released a book to wide acclaim, right, the more you start to evaluate, is what I'm creating right now good or bad? You can't create. You can't make art that way.
Mm-hmm.
So it's illogical and it's unhelpful to think that way.
Mm-hmm.
You can make an argument that it's worth thinking that way, but you can't make an argument that it helps you to actually create the art. And really, you could probably count on one hand the number of, let's say musicians, the number of famous musicians who each successive album fans would say is better than the previous one all the way through their whole career.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's
even those
that phrase, the difficult second album, because the
sophomore slump
expectation. Yeah.
I think even in that phrase, like the second album is probably usually like the third or the fourth, because usually the most popular one or the one that like puts people on the map is usually like at least number 2 or 3.
Yeah, sometimes it depends. But I mean, either way, the fact that we can all have this conversation is indicative of the fact that like every single musician out there will say, I like our more recent stuff better than the earlier stuff. And all the fans will say, I like the earlier stuff better.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is a thing about that. People will look at a successful artist and who they are and the art that they create at the height of their success.
Mm-hmm.
And they assume, because of where the person who's evaluating it is, they're trying to figure out what to do and how to be in order to get there. So they assume they're evaluating it through the lens that the person who got there was doing the same thing. Meaning that Adele, to use your example, when she was 12 years old, was thinking, how can I get to be this very like powerful jazzy torch singer, whatever, and then aimed their efforts at becoming that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not how these industries work. And
how do they work, Brandon?
Well, okay. We're going all over the place, which is fun. It's just that
5 minutes.
how the art industry works. I mean, there are different industries and they work differently. Is different than the artistic process.
Yeah.
There's overlap, I guess. How it works is I create something and I put it out there. And like literally this stream. This is the philosophy behind doing this stream, what we're all doing every week. I create something and I put it out there. And maybe nobody sees it. And maybe one person sees it. And if that one person that sees it likes it, then they're likely, or more likely than they otherwise would have been, to come back and look at my second effort because they liked the first one.
Yeah.
If they don't like it, they're not going to come back and look at the second effort.
Mm-hmm.
What that means is that everybody who likes something you put out there sticks around and comes back for the next thing. And everybody who doesn't like what you put out there moves on. It does not actually cost you anything to have somebody observe something you created and dislike it. It costs you nothing.
Well, I
They
guess
already weren't going to be looking at it.
the only example I can think of though is like kind of the people. I'm gonna try to avoid using the word troll, but also use it. People who will say like kind of awful things in comments or be really like inflammatory or derogatory. Like, I don't know. Isn't that technically a cost?
And what could you do to your art to make it so that you are impervious to that kind of response?
Absolutely nothing.
If you are going to share your art with the greater public, which you do not have to do, you are allowed to be an artist who does not share their art with the wide public.
You're
Right,
using
like-
the general you, right? Just general.
I am, but
Yeah.
that makes it sound like it's relevant to you, so good for that. You don't. Like, one of the early things I put on our website back in the day was, you don't have to make art to be an artist. You don't have to hang out to be a friend. You don't have to be productive to be valuable. You are what you are, regardless of what you do. So you do it however it works for you, right? Like, especially when it comes to artists, people will say things like, yeah, I'm not really an artist, because they mean I don't make money off of my art. Like, that's the guiding principle.
Mm-hmm.
Humans have been singing and dancing and drawing in the dirt for millions of years, not because we are good at it or trying to be good at it, not because we're trying to make money or get better or develop skill or a following, but just because it is an enjoyable human thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Having said all that, if your goal is to put your stuff out there to the wider public, then yes, part of what you have to accept, and this I realize is one of the things I cut myself off from earlier. I think the great difficulty in being an artist is not the skill of the like execution. It's in tolerating the discomfort of communicating to people that you don't know, that will misinterpret what you're trying to get across without you being able to clarify what you were trying to state,
Mm-hmm.
that will hate what you are trying to do. If you create something and nobody has any strong negative reactions to it, it's also likely that nobody has any strong positive reactions to it either.
Yeah.
So what does it cost you for that troll to say that? You can say it's very difficult and painful emotionally, which is fair, but does it have to be?
Well, it's not useful because it makes people hide. If they're
Yeah, I
going
mean,
through things.
again, there's a reason that, as just like a popular cultural example, Paul Rudd does not watch his own performances. There's a reason that many artists do that. That by the time you have finished creating a piece of art, you have grown and changed as an artist through the process of creating that art. So by the time you're done creating something, you're better, quote unquote, in your own estimation. You've become more of what you want to be than you were when you started the thing. I think it's pretty impossible for any artist to look at art that they have made and said, this is my best work. Because you're better than that by the time you're done making it. Which is why, again, I try to emphasize to people, your job is to just say, do I feel comfortable sharing this with so-and-so, a particular person or group of people or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them are going to like it, some of them are going to hate it. That's what you need to work on. Because art, like everything, is iterative. But because art is a piece of communication intended to be shared with an audience, unspecified future people, you cannot iterate until you do that part. So artists get stuck in this loop where they think they're iterating by coming up with an idea, writing the song, listening to it themselves, critiquing and evaluating the idea, modifying the song, listening to it. They think that's a cycle of iteration. It is not. You don't iterate until somebody else has experienced the art and you've gotten some feedback from that.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, you're just spinning your wheels. And so the difficulty, the reason that there are only so many people out there who make it successfully at this is because it's really, really difficult to put your stuff out there over and over and over and over and over, because you can have 1,000 people saying it's great and one person saying that you made them want to kill themselves. And guess which one you're going to remember and think about and worry about the next time you're making something. So you asked earlier, how does the industry work? And in that context, what we were talking about is how you acquire a following. It's not, you don't design who you're going to be and then work until you get there. You just put your stuff out, and then people who like your stuff continue to follow you and suggest and share and spread your stuff. And of the people that they share it to, some of those people will like it and some won't. You just acquire a following over time, because even if only 1 out of 1,000 people who view your stuff likes it, well, that's one person. The next time you release something, you got one person baked in, where the first time you were starting from zero. There's a reason that influencers, streamers, whatever, are becoming like such a dominant form of content creation, because they make so much stuff and they put it all out there. Oh, we lost Caitlin, and now she's switching to her phone. Hold on, I'm going to drop that version.
Computer died.
Oh, okay. Well, now you're back with us on your phone.
Yeah.
You just have to create stuff, put it out, put it out. And yes, Caitlin, I know we got to get wrapping up. So I'll say Caitlin referred to a framework that I use with people is to have your alpha audience and your beta audience. These are terms from like, product development and whatever. Your alpha audience, I coach people to do. Your alpha audience is somebody that you are confident that their feelings toward you, their estimation or perception of you, the nature of your relationship will be unimpacted by them viewing your art, experiencing your art. They're not going to like you more or less or think better of you or worse of you. This is why like spouses are very common people that are going to be the first one that gets to see the art. Parents are very commonly the people who are the first ones that get to see the art.
Mm-hmm.
For your alpha audience, it does not matter if they like the kind of stuff you're creating, right? Like you make metal music and your parents hate metal music, doesn't matter. That's not the point of the alpha audience. The alpha audience is just for you to have somebody to show it to you. Your job is to decide, is it ready to show to the alpha audience? The alpha audience's job is to tell you when it's ready to share with the beta audience. And the beta audience's job is to tell you when it's ready to share with the wider public. The beta, so the qualification for alpha is that there's somebody whose estimation relationship won't change. Qualification for beta is that, no, these are people who actually do like the kind of thing that you're trying to create. Mm-hmm. So if you're writing a fantasy novel, it doesn't matter if you're sharing it with your best friend or your sister or whatever, if they like fantasy. But once you get to the beta audience, yes, you want your beta audience to be composed of people who read fantasy novels, who enjoy fantasy novels. And we can do some stuff if you want to continue this another time. I have some specific like frameworks and approaches on soliciting feedback in ways that I think are most useful and iterating whatever. But as a general thing, please, you're going to evaluate whether your stuff is good or bad, by which we mean you're going to evaluate whether you think other people will like it or not. You can't stop yourself from doing that. That's fine. But just know that's not the thing you make the decision on. You say, am I ready to share it with my alpha audience? And once they say, this is good, you should share it to the beta people. Then you share it with your beta audience. And once they say, yeah, this is great, put it out there. That's when you release it. Mm-hmm. 100% of the time, if someone is stuck with their art, they're trying to work on their art and they're getting stuck with it, they don't have audience. That's the thing. And they think that if they keep working on the art, the audience will come. It's the other way around. That's like trying to have a conversation with somebody that isn't there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's literally planning out those arguments in your head that you're going to have with somebody later on. It will loop forever, stress you out and make you miserable. You have to actually talk to the other person. You need, if your objective is to make art, you have to actually show it to people. Mm-hmm. And wondering whether they will like it or not gets in the way of that.
Thank you for coming to the This Is Not Therapy.
Thank you. Yeah, we can wrap up. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been good. Thank you both. Thanks for joining.
Nice to see you, Maria. I missed you. I don't think I've seen you for like 5 weeks.
It's been a few weeks, I think. Yeah. I don't know. It's been a couple of weeks anyway.
I changed my mind. Can I share one last thing real quick? Are you guys okay if we do one last thing? Just because of the comment about being scarred by the immortality of social media, I want to put this out there. Every single person, the two of you, anyone who's listening or watching this, think of a time where you, like, someone showed you a song or a show or a book or whatever, and you didn't care for it. You didn't like it. Who was it by? You don't remember for the most part, right? Meaning that if that person's work crossed your desk again, if somebody else was like, hey, you should listen to this new song, you wouldn't see it and be like, wait a second, I listened to one of these people's song like 10 years ago and didn't like it, so I'm not going to like this one. The people who don't like your stuff don't remember you. If they like you, they come back. If they don't, they move on. Which means if you put out something that nobody likes, oh well, that doesn't stop you from putting out something that everybody likes the next day.
Mm-hmm.
Having a failed attempt costs you nothing other than the emotional element of feeling bad about not accomplishing what you're trying to accomplish, or taking criticism very difficult, or whatever. And those are things that can be worked on. Successful artists work on those things. They have conquered them or have some way of moving through them.
Mm-hmm.
You have to. My favorite quote, Chuck Close, a famous painter: inspiration is for amateurs. The rest of us show up and get to work. And I'm paraphrasing from here on out, but we engage in the process. We mix things together and we kick open doors, and we trust that in doing so, things will occur to us that never would have happened had we sat there waiting for a bolt of inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, it's not an elitist, like, what it means. You can't sit around and wait for, this is the idea. This is it. Now it's ready. This is perfect. You just do stuff, and you trust that in doing that stuff will come up. But yeah, I don't care how successful an artist is. You ask them, they'll tell you they're not real happy with their own stuff. Literally, Taylor Swift is like, if we had to pick somebody as the like most across the board appeal artist, I think Taylor Swift is a good candidate for that,
Yeah.
right?
Ridiculously popular.
And she has a documentary, or just had a documentary come out, in which she's talking about how difficult it is for her to constantly be trying to figure out how to be the person that everybody wants her to be. Like, being successful in art does not remove the difficulty of caring so much about how other people view you and your art.
Mm-hmm.
But other endeavors carry their own difficulties too. There's nothing you can do that has nothing difficult associated with it. So just know, sharing it with people, that's the thing that's stopping you. Not your skill level, not your lack of ideas. The fact that you're not sharing it with anyone.
Thanks, Brandon. Thanks, Marie.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks for joining us in the chat. See you this time next week, hopefully.
Yes, back in the office, hopefully. Bye, all.
Bye.